Hi, my name is Devin Louie, and I'm a civil engineering major, urban planning minor here at the University of California, Irvine. And today we're going to be talking about infrastructure, the importance of infrastructure, what infrastructure is exactly, and how it relates to all these issues we've been talking about in the class so far. So let's jump right in. So the first thing that we want to look at, and you're seeing 4 images here, and these are from different places around the world. And what you probably get is a sense of what these places are like just by looking at the physical infrastructure around them. If you look at the top left picture, you see large buildings, neon signs. It seems very modern. When you look at the picture on the bottom left, it seems strikingly different. It looks as though a woman is carrying water or something else on her head down an unpaved road through somewhat of a rural country. In the top right, you see something similar. It looks like a shantytown built along a river. And at the bottom right, you see another waterfront community, but this one seems very different, much more modern, with better infrastructure. All of these things are based off what we see in the built environment. They provide different services and different levels of services for the people that live there. The top left one is actually Shibuya Square in Tokyo. The top right one is from the Ganges River in India. The bottom left one is from Peru, and the bottom right one is from the Netherlands. So what exactly is infrastructure? What are we looking at? What are we seeing and noticing? Well, infrastructure is the foundation upon which societies are built. It's the small building blocks that provide for the goods and services that people need every day. The basic physical and organizational structures needed for the operation and safety of people around the world. And these are things that countries and people think about every single day. As a civil engineer, it's something that I hope to do with the rest of my life. So there's actually 2 types of infrastructure that we're going to be focusing on today. They are physical and non-physical infrastructure. So physical infrastructure would include things like transportation systems, roadways, railways, ports. Another one would be utilities, bringing electricity to people, fresh drinking water, taking away wastewater. And lastly, telecommunications technologies, or phone lines, cell phone lines, satellite services like GPS and mapping. So transportation. What do we talk about when we talk about transportation infrastructure? It would be things like roads, airports, and seaports. So roadway, a good example would be an interstate. An interstate is a very high and complex infrastructure project. It moves thousands of people each day, and it requires a lot of things like overpasses, on and off ramps, control signals, signage, things like that. Airports are also extremely important. They move lots of people and goods around the world extremely quickly. They require things like terminals, security, ways for people to get to and from the airport, as well as runways, air traffic control stations, and things like that. And lastly, we have seaports. Seaports might be something that you're not super familiar with. You might have seen them when you drive by, but you haven't really stopped to notice what they're doing. Seaports are actually how we move most of the world's goods and cargo, especially here in the United States. Things get shipped from all over the world here, like from China or Europe. Most of them arrive on ships. And our ports are something that are extremely important to us because the more efficient we build our ports, the better and easier we can get goods and services here in the US. So the importance of transportation infrastructure. This might seem somewhat self-explanatory. People are always going to be able to need to move themselves and their goods around either the country or the world. And transportation infrastructure allows them to do this. A great example of this might be the Channel Tunnel in Europe. It's a tunnel that connects Great Britain to France, and it's the first time that there's been a physical connection between the two other than just by sea. And this allows them to move people extremely quickly. In fact, you could live in London and work in France and be able to commute back and forth almost every day extremely quickly and easily. Now, this is important for 2 reasons. One, it allows people to get back and forth easy, and that can help facilitate more connections, but it also makes ties between 2 countries. When more people are able to commute back and forth, you can form more bonds and get more cultural influences from each place. And this can be extremely important for international relations and global stability in the future. Another thing that transportation infrastructure can do for us is provide safety and security. Many of you might be familiar with the interstate system here in the United States, but what you might not know is its full name. It's actually called the United States Interstate Highway System it's actually called the Eisenhower National System of Interstates and Defense Highways. And it was originally built as a way of getting troops and goods around the country in case we were ever invaded. And today, it does serve as more of an economic base, but it still is required that we build to certain standards that facilitate military uses, like the movement of tanks or heavy machinery, if the time requires. Utilities are another major part of physical infrastructure. They allow us to transport energy, water, and get rid of wastewater every day. Major utility projects might include hydroelectric dams or the power lines that get energy from the dam to where we live today. An example of this would be Hoover Dam on the border between Nevada and Arizona. We require thousands of miles of transmission lines to get that energy from Hoover Dam to places like Las Vegas, Los Angeles, San Francisco, the California Central Valley, and even places in Arizona. All of these things are required. You can't just have one infrastructure project and not have it connected to everything else. It just doesn't work that way. Another example would be waterways and getting clean water to everyone's homes. There are thousands of miles of underground pipes underneath every street and highway that gets fresh water from where we get it from, such as deltas and rivers and dams, and gets it to your home or your drinking fountain, anything that you use every day. And here in the United States, it might be something that we take for granted, being able to turn on the tap and get fresh drinking water. But there are many places in the world where that's not true. Like you saw in the picture in Peru, where you might have to transport it from a well to your home, which might be miles away. And this brings us to the importance of utilities. There are 1.1 billion people in developing countries that have inadequate access to fresh drinking water. And this is a major challenge, both for international stability as well as international health. And it's something that the UN and other non-governmental organizations are trying to tackle every day. This also means that there's wastewater problems. Just because you might have access to fresh drinking water doesn't mean it's always going to stay that way. As global populations increase, it's important that we deal with the waste generated from each and every person in a safe and sustainable way. And wastewater treatment centers and wastewater systems are an important way in which we do that. By making sure that we take wastewater away in a safe way, clean it, and are able to discharge it back into the natural system is an extremely important thing for us. And that brings us to our last example of physical infrastructure, and that would be communications technologies. This is something that's extremely important and definitely emerging in the 21st century. Things like cell phones and the internet are changing how we communicate with people around the world and how we interact with our neighbors. And these things all require physical infrastructure. Cell phones might require cell towers or satellites in space to transmit your call anywhere around the world. The internet is going to require you to have a wire that physically connects your computer to someone else's. And there are thousands and thousands of miles of cables and wires that connect us and tie us all together. Another important one might be television sets. We all use TV every day to get our news and entertainment, to find out what's going around the world and how we can influence that. That all requires infrastructure, whether it be the cameras in the studios to record the people, or whether it be the cables to transmit that signal to your house so you can see it every day. So all of these things play into physical infrastructure. Like we talked about, transportation, communication, and utilities are all extremely important to us, and we use them every day. It's important to know that most of these things aren't something that you're going to see or think about, especially here in this country, but they're things that people need around the world. They promote connections, and they allow us to do things that we never were able to do before, like talk to people in real time anywhere on the planet, or to access clean and safe, reliable drinking water every single day. In addition to all this physical infrastructure, there's also non-physical infrastructure, and that's extremely important to us as well. So non-physical infrastructure would be the things that you can't touch in the world. So things like the legal system, financial system, healthcare system, education, or social welfare. All of these things are building blocks to societies and therefore part of infrastructure, but you can't necessarily go out and touch all of them. So let's jump into some more examples. So the legal system. Well, the legal system would be our set of laws and courts, judges, and things like that. So it might have a physical component, like the physical courthouse or the people that work there, but there's definitely a non-physical component to it as well, like the laws or the idea of justice. things that we can't go out and necessarily see in the real world, but we know they're extremely important to making society work. And having a stable system of laws and a strong base of laws is important for any country, whether it be a criminal justice system or even business law. If you don't have rules by which people can play by, people aren't going to feel comfortable or safe working in that environment. And you're not going to be able to facilitate a strong sense of national pride or even be able to create a strong economy. Another one of these non-physical infrastructures would be the healthcare system. Again, it has a physical component like doctors' offices or hospitals, but there's also a non-physical component like ethics or the idea of health. Being healthy isn't necessarily always a physical condition, but it could be a feeling that someone has. And having the infrastructure to facilitate good healthcare is extremely important. You can't just have hospitals, you can't just have doctors, you need to have both. And here in America, we even have an entire system. We have primary care doctors, which you might be able to go see on a regular basis for regular checkups. Then there's emergency rooms and emergency services if there's ever something that requires immediate action, right? Having different levels of healthcare can help create a better system overall that can take care of the needs of everybody rather than only just a few. And this is a point of major concern in our country and around the world is providing good healthcare infrastructure for people. What does that mean? How do we provide that? Are all important questions that we have to face going forward. And countries that fail to meet these objectives, that don't provide good healthcare and access to everybody, aren't going to be as strong or competitive as the world globalizes. People are going to want to live in the places where they feel safe and secure, and healthcare is definitely one of those things that people require. And that brings us to the financial system. Again, a great example. So the financial system is really made up of two parts, the banking system and the monetary system. So the banking system would be more the physical component, right? It would be the physical banks or ATMs where you go and store your money. Banks are a place where people put money to save it. The monetary system, however, is definitely more of a non-physical component of this. The monetary system is the idea of money. How much is your money worth? What can you do with money? Who accepts or exchanges money for other things? In our country, we have what's called the Federal Reserve Bank, and they're our central bank that dictates our monetary policy and sets all of those things. And they're really in charge of the monetary infrastructure of our country. And as you can see with this past recession, it's extremely important to have a strong monetary system. If people can't rely on money to be a storage of their wealth or their work, then they're going to have to turn to other things like trading commodities or other goods or services. Money is extremely important to any good economy, which means it's also important to the security and stability of any nation. That brings us to the education system, and something that you guys are all pretty much very familiar with since you're in our educational system right now. So again, physical components might include the classrooms, the desks, or the textbooks that you guys use, but it also includes non-physical components like education standards, the idea of knowledge or what you might need to know. And as you know, setting these standards is something that's really been talked about recently, whether it be No Child Left Behind or standardized test scores. We all need to think about what are these things? What are the components that build a strong educational system? Is it just about setting standards? Is it just about saying that you need to know how to do this kind of math at this certain age? Or is it more facilitating a more broad look at education? Is it setting more broad standards? Like, I hope that students are able to critically think about goals or understand why things are happening and not just the factual information. Setting these standards and these building blocks are important to setting a good educational system. And again, you need both the physical components, good classrooms, good textbooks, and good materials to facilitate the non-physical components of this, which would be education. Having both and the interaction between the two is extremely important. And again, I think we can all agree that a strong educational system is an important base for any good country. And the last one we want to talk about today are the social welfare system. And this would include things like food stamps, unemployment benefits, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, which is essentially health care for the elderly or poor. And these are things that are what we call social safety nets. They're there to protect people that have low incomes or that are extremely vulnerable in our society. And this is actually a rather modern idea. It was created just in the last century, coming out of the Great Depression. And it's a way that we created infrastructure to make sure that people didn't fall through the cracks. And this is something that's been talked about a lot, especially with budget crises. Infrastructure is not cheap, and social infrastructure is something that takes a lot of our national income to support. And how we go about this and what we do with it are all things that people talk about. And it's important that we talk about it because, again, social infrastructure or non-physical infrastructure is just as important as the physical infrastructure, even though you might not be able to see it or touch it every day. So now that we've talked about non-physical infrastructure, it's important to understand why these things aren't happening. I think we can all agree that physical infrastructure, non-physical infrastructure are all really important. They provide goods and services and benefits for everyone. So why don't we see it everywhere? Why don't we invest all this money in infrastructure? Why do people always talk about it as if it's something that hasn't happened or something that always needs improvement? It seems like if it's such a black and white decision, it should be something easy that we can all agree on. But infrastructure is incredibly complex, especially when you start talking about it in terms of economics and feasibility. Now, one of the main things about infrastructure is that it's really expensive. If you think about interstate highways or airports, seaports, or anything like that, even satellites in space, these are things that can cost millions or even billions of dollars. In fact, many major infrastructure projects like California's proposed high-speed rail, the new Bay Bridge in San Francisco, or even basic highway extensions here in Orange County can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to do. And that's why people always talk about it and debate it so much. With so much money going into these projects, it's important that we get it right the first time. But we all know that our resources are limited here in this country and also around the world. It's something that developing countries deal with every day. Places like China and Brazil that need a lot of infrastructure projects to start building up their economy and to facilitate their growing middle class are all struggling with problems of financing them. Where do they get the money from? Where do they get the knowledge and the skills from to build these massive national projects, or sometimes even international projects? If you look at places like India and Pakistan, building infrastructure doesn't just affect one country, it affects multiple countries down the line. A great example would be dams in India. When India dams certain rivers, it can block the amount of water that gets into neighboring countries like Pakistan. Therefore, it's important that the two countries work together and understand that both countries require and should have use of those water resources. And sometimes it can lead to issues where one country takes too much water or too much of one resource and another country doesn't get enough of it. These are all things that play into international politics and a reason why infrastructure is important to international relations. So as we take a look at this next image, it seems like a cartoon drawing, but it actually has an important social commentary about our country. What you're seeing here are an example of our roads, perhaps it looks like a highway, being held up with crossed fingers. And what this is supposed to be showing us is that here in America, we're really crossing our fingers, hoping that our infrastructure doesn't fail us. One of the main things about infrastructure is even though it's expensive to build, it can sometimes be even more expensive to maintain it. And that's something that our country is facing right now. With an aging infrastructure, many of our roads, bridges, and dams are coming up on the end of their life expectancy. As an engineer, I can tell you right now, we only design things to last for a certain number of years. Typically, it's 50 or 100 years depending on what the project is. But many of our projects are coming up on the end of their lifespan or have passed it, which means that they might not be as safe to drive on or use anymore. As you drive over bridges, you might see cracks in the concrete or rusting rebar falling out of it. Even potholes in the road are all examples of failing or degrading infrastructure. And this image is showing us that here in America, we're really reaching the end of the life expectancy. We need to start investing in things again and making some of the difficult decisions ahead in order to ensure that our infrastructure is strong enough for our next generation. And as we've seen, infrastructure as the building blocks of our society touches on almost every aspect of our country, whether it be economics, political, or social well-being. And it's something that we definitely need to think about going forward. So what we're looking at here is an ASCE report card, or the American Society of Civil Engineers. It's an association of all the professional engineers in our country, and what they've done is they've gotten together and looked at different infrastructure projects around our country. Things like bridges and dams, public works projects, roads, schools, waste facilities, water treatment facilities, all the things that are really important to us. And they've gone through and given them a grade every couple of years to try to track and show people how we're doing on our infrastructure. And what you can see as a common theme is we're not doing very well. We are getting a lot of C's, a lot of D's, and one B minus. And what that's showing us is that our infrastructure is failing, and it's something that we need to take notice of. If you were to take these grades home to your parents, they probably wouldn't be very happy with you. Barely passing, or even sometimes failing, is definitely not acceptable, and it's something that we shouldn't accept in our country or anywhere around the world. As we go forward, it's important to know that infrastructure is always an investment in our future. It costs a lot of money to build and maintain, and you're never going to see a direct payment from those projects. Highways don't make money directly, but they allow us to build up our economy and build up our workforce and get around our cities much easier. And therefore, they pay themselves off in other ways, in economic growth, in spurring economic development and new neighborhoods and new opportunities for people. So as we go forward, it's important to take note of this report card and understand that infrastructure is not something that is static. It's constantly something that is changing and growing and that we need to continue to invest in. And that's also something that's true as the world changes. It's not always necessarily age that can make infrastructure obsolete or not function as well. As we go into a new modern economy with green jobs, a focus on sustainability and globalization, certain infrastructure projects might become more important while others become less important. Things that you've heard a lot about in the recent past have probably included green infrastructure or things that provide sustainability, sustainable energy, clean energy, more efficient homes. This might include things like solar plants, wind turbines, new hydroelectric dams going up. These are all things that even just a couple decades ago, we didn't think about, but they're important as we go into a new energy field and a new economy in the future. Other things like coal-fired power plants or oil facilities might become less important in the future. As our reliance on oil diminishes, we might not need as many oil refineries. We might not need as many oil rigs. So understanding where the economy and where the world is going in the future is important. We need to start building infrastructure projects that facilitate the change that is coming and not the past. So good examples of this would include these two images. And what you're seeing are major train stations in two very different countries around the world. On the left is the train station in Berlin, built for the World Cup in the 2000s. And what you can see here is a very modern train station. It looks clean. There's actually 4 different levels servicing local trains, regional trains, European high-speed rail, and a local subway system. And what this does is it's allowed Berlin to enter into a new age of mass transportation. It's facilitated thousands of people moving through there every single day, and it serves as a major hub for the rest of the country. What you see on the right is, again, another major train station, but this one is in Mumbai, India. And this was built back when India was still part of the United Kingdom, and it hasn't really been updated since, mostly because India hasn't had the money to upgrade it yet. What you can see is hundreds, if not thousands of people waiting at the station platform and a train just barely getting in. It seems crowded and at some points unsafe if you were to fall onto the station platform. And actually what's a common practice in India, because the train stations are so crowded, is once the train pulls in, people literally climb over the train to get to another platform, or sometimes even right on top of the train if the train is full. This is a great example of aging infrastructure. When this train station was built in India, it met all of the needs of the people at the time. But now it's aged and it seems outdated. And it's definitely important that as India goes forward and tries to become a developed nation, they're going to have to invest in things like better train stations to meet the needs of their growing population. Another good example would be, and this time of an entire city, would be Shanghai in China. This image was taken in 1990, and it seems more like an aged city. This is before Shanghai really modernized. If we look at this next image, this is Shanghai in 2010, and it's dramatically different. You see modern skyscrapers, buildings lit up in hundreds of lights. Even the seaway and the river there seems to be inhabited by more commercial boats rather than shipping containers, right? And this all has to do with China developing and emerging as a modern nation. They've invested in their infrastructure. They're seeing modern cities that have modern sewage treatment, more access to clean water, better roads and railways, all things that are extremely important if China hopes to emerge into the modern economy. Now that more people are working in the service sector, meaning they have white-collar jobs or they work behind a desk or in an office building every day rather than out in the farmlands or a factory, you need to provide different services for them. No longer do they necessarily need access to fertilizer or trucks to carry the goods into the ports. Now they might need a train to take them from their modern apartment to their office building. They might need a coffee shop or a new roadway if they're able to buy a car. All of these things are things that we have to think about as we build infrastructure. This is another good example of physical infrastructure in China. This is the Three Gorges Dam, which is the largest dam in the world currently. And this is providing both utilities. It makes a huge amount of electricity that powers most of the cities in China, as well as fresh drinking water to many of the citizens, as well as flood control. So this one single infrastructure project is providing multiple benefits for the country, and it's extremely important. Again, being the largest dam in the world, it cost China a pretty penny to build, but it's something that China's going to see and reap the benefits of for decades to come. And this last example, this is actually an example of a mass transit system in Bogota, Colombia. And this might seem a little counterintuitive. When you think of Colombia, you might not think of a modern city or a really dense city, but in fact, Bogota is one of Colombia's major cities, and it's got almost as many people as the greater Los Angeles area. It's a major metropolitan center. And for decades, Bogota really struggled with traffic and getting people around. They don't really have the same kind of highways in Colombia as we do here in the United States. So people had to use large boulevards, and it would sometimes take people over an hour to commute from their homes in the suburbs into the center of the city where they worked. In 2000, the mayor came up with this idea to build a new busway. And what this has allowed people to do is get in and out of the city much more efficiently. It's given people the ability to spend less time in their car and more time with their friends and family. They've done surveys and they found that people's quality of life and enjoyment of life has actually improved in the city multiple times just because they have better access to transportation and better infrastructure. So as we go forward, it's important to understand that infrastructure, both the physical and non-physical components of it, play a major role in the building blocks of our society. They allow us to achieve our goals, meet our economic needs and desires, as well as meet our social needs, allow us to get around and communicate with family and friends. But also, we need to understand the challenges that infrastructure has. It's extremely expensive to build and maintain. It's something that can sometimes affect not just you or your city, but cities around you, or even countries around you. As resources become more limited in our world, it's important to understand the interactions that infrastructure can have and the importance that it's going to play in our modern emerging economies. So I want you to definitely take away that infrastructure is important. It might not seem like it's connected to international relations, but in reality, infrastructure touches on all points and aspects of our lives. Understand that it's not just one thing. You don't just build one dam or one busway. Infrastructure is a system. It works with the non-physical and physical components to meet and bring you the things that you need every day. So I hope that you've learned something, and I definitely hope that as you go forward with this class in Global Connect, you understand that and are able to use infrastructure as an important talking point and basis for your arguments and understanding of how the world works and what the world may look like in the future.